In 1511, in the holy city of Mecca, a man named Khair Beg ordered every coffee house in the city shut down and burned. Khair Beg was not a random bureaucrat. He was the governor, appointed by the Mamluk Sultanate, and he believed the crowds gathering inside those smoke-filled rooms were plotting against him. Men were drinking a strange black liquid, arguing about politics, reciting poetry, and gambling late into the night. Khair Beg convened a council of jurists, and together they declared the drink intoxicating and therefore forbidden under Islamic law. Coffee was banned. Coffee drinkers were beaten in the street. Coffee stockpiles were set on fire in public squares, the smoke curling up over a city that had never smelled anything quite like it. And it did not work. Within a matter of years, the ban was overturned by a higher religious authority in Cairo. Khair Beg himself was executed on unrelated charges, and coffee came roaring back, stronger than before. Governments would try to ban this drink again and again over the next 2 centuries. In Mecca, in Cairo, in Constantinople, in Rome, in Prussia, in Sweden. Kings threatened prison. Clergy threatened damnation. Sultans threatened death, and in at least one documented case in Constantinople, that threat was not a bluff. And every single time, the drink won. Think about that for a second. An entire beverage, hunted by empires, banned by sultans, condemned from pulpits, and it still conquered the world anyway. Today, you can walk into almost any store on Earth and buy the very same substance for around $3. Nobody threatens to burn it down anymore. Nobody calls it the devil's drink. It just sits on a shelf next to the sugar and the paper filters, utterly unremarkable. So how did a bitter, dark liquid brewed from the roasted seeds of a jungle shrub go from something worth executing people over to something you barely think about before your first meeting of the day? How did it fuel revolutions, bankroll empires, enslave millions, and eventually help power the machines of the Industrial Revolution itself? That was 1511. But the story of coffee does not start in Arabia at all. It starts almost 700 years earlier, in the highlands of a country most people cannot find on a map, Ethiopia. Coffee's true origin story is tangled up with one of the most famous legends in food history. So let us get the legend out of the way first. As the story goes, sometime around the year 850, an Ethiopian goat herder named Kaldi noticed that his goats were behaving strangely after eating the bright red berries of a certain shrub. They were jumping, bleeding, and refusing to sleep. Kaldi, understandably curious, tried the berries himself, felt the same jolt of energy, and eventually brought them to a nearby monastery where a monk supposedly threw them into the fire in disapproval, only for the roasting beans to release an irresistible aroma. Now, that story is almost certainly a myth. It was not written down until centuries after it supposedly happened, and no contemporary source from Kaldi's era mentions him at all. But the fact that this story exists at all and that it still gets repeated on coffee bags and cafe walls today tells you something. People have always sensed that coffee's discovery must have been an accident because nothing about a coffee cherry looks edible in the first place. The fruit is bitter. The seed inside is hard as a pebble. It has to be picked, pulped, fermented, dried, roasted, and ground before it becomes anything close to drinkable. Nobody stumbles into that process by luck alone. Here is a detail that rarely makes it into the popular version of the story. The wild coffee plant itself, a modest, glossy-leafed shrub that can grow into a small tree if left untended, produces cherries that ripen from green to a deep, almost glowing red, clustered tightly along its branches. Inside each cherry sit 2 flat-sided seeds, pressed face to face, which is the part of the plant humans eventually learn to roast. Botanists now recognize dozens of wild coffee species native to the forests of eastern Africa, most of them commercially useless, bitter beyond drinking, or nearly barren of fruit. Only a small handful ever proved worth cultivating, and of those, one species in particular, Arabica, would eventually come to dominate the entire global industry. Nobody in 9th century Ethiopia understood any of this in scientific terms. They did not know the word genetics. They did not know the word alkaloid. They were doing it anyway, through generations of trial, observation, and patience, quietly selecting the plants that produce the strongest effect and the most reliable harvest, long before anyone had a word for what they were selecting for. What the historical record actually supports is this. Coffee likely grew wild in the forests of what is now Ethiopia for thousands of years before anyone systematically cultivated it. Local communities in the region chewed the raw berries or mixed them with animal fat to make a kind of energy paste that warriors reportedly carried into battle. This was not brewed coffee. There was no cup, no roasting, no ritual. It was survival food, plain and simple, prized for one reason only. It kept people alert and moving on long journeys with limited supplies. In a world without refined sugar, without modern nutrition science, and without any understanding of caffeine as a chemical compound, this was not a luxury. It was an edge. And an edge in the ancient world was everything. The real transformation happened across a narrow stretch of water in Yemen, sometime around the 1400s. Sufi monks in Yemeni monasteries began roasting and brewing the beans into a drink they called Kawa, a word that originally referred to wine and which would eventually evolve through Turkish and Dutch and dozens of other languages into the English word coffee. These monks were not looking for a pleasant afternoon pick-me-up. They needed to stay awake through long nights of prayer and chanting, and coffee did exactly that. Here is the detail that makes this strange. A drink discovered as battlefield fuel in Ethiopia became a devotional aid in Yemen. And it is this second use, the religious one, that gave coffee its first real infrastructure. Monasteries began cultivating coffee trees deliberately. Port cities began exporting it. And by the port of Mecca, a name you will recognize instantly if you have ever ordered a chocolate coffee drink, Yemen had built the first true coffee trade in human history. This is where the story leaves the monastery and enters the world of empire. The Ottoman Empire, controlling much of the Arabian Peninsula and the eastern Mediterranean by the 1500s, adopted coffee with astonishing speed. Coffee houses, called kahve-khaneh in Persian and kahve-khanehs in Ottoman Turkish, opened across Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and eventually Constantinople, the beating heart of the empire. These were not just places to drink a beverage. They were the internet cafes of the 16th century, minus the internet. Men gathered to read, to debate, to play chess, to listen to music and poetry, and crucially, to talk politics. Openly, in a way that made rulers deeply nervous. This was not about the taste of a bitter drink. Coffee houses were becoming engines of public opinion, and public opinion is exactly what an empire cannot control once it starts moving. That is why Beg tried to burn it out of Mecca in 1511. That is why, decades later in Constantinople, Sultan Murad IV reportedly walked the streets in disguise and personally executed coffeehouse patrons who defied his ban. A punishment historians debate the full scale of, but which multiple period sources describe as brutally real. Coffee was not just a drink to these rulers. It was a delivery system for dissent. One cup at a time. Picture what one of these early coffee houses actually felt like, because it was not remotely like a quiet study hall. The air was thick with the smell of roasting beans, wood smoke, and rose water, mixed with the low murmur of dozens of conversations happening at once. Patrons sat cross-legged on cushions rather than chairs, sipping thick, unfiltered coffee from small handleless cups, while storytellers, musicians, and chess players competed for attention in the same crowded room. This was entertainment, education, gossip, and business, all folded into a single institution, open to any man who could pay a small fee, regardless of his rank in society. That last detail mattered enormously. In a rigidly stratified world, where a peasant and a nobleman almost never occupied the same physical space as equals, the coffee house briefly flattened the hierarchy, and that alone was enough to make rulers nervous. And still it spread. By the mid-1500s, coffee had become so embedded in Ottoman daily life that a woman could reportedly divorce her husband under Ottoman law if he failed to provide her with a sufficient daily quota of it. Coffee was written into marriage contracts. Coffee was taxed. Coffee funded caravans, funded merchants, funded entire trade networks running from the mountains of Yemen up through the Red Sea and into the markets of the Ottoman world. And for roughly 200 years, the Arab world guarded this crop as one of its most valuable secrets. Here is the uncomfortable reality that almost nobody remembers about coffee's early history. For centuries, it was illegal to export a live, fertile coffee plant or an unroasted, viable seed out of Yemen. Beans were parched or boiled before they left port, specifically to prevent anyone from germinating them elsewhere. The Arab world had a monopoly on the most addictive beverage on the planet, and they intended to keep it that way. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, a very different kind of empire was watching, and it wanted in. Venetian merchants, who built their entire economy on trade routes stretching into the Ottoman world, began bringing coffee back to Italy sometime in the early 1600s. And Europe's reaction was, to put it gently, not enthusiastic. This was a black, bitter, unfamiliar drink, arriving from the Muslim world at a time of deep religious and political tension between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Catholic clergy in particular were suspicious. Some reportedly called it the bitter invention of Satan, an intoxicant of the infidel, dangerous to both body and soul. And no, that is not something anyone made up for a documentary. That was a real theological anxiety, debated seriously in real churches by real clergymen who genuinely believed a beverage might be spiritually corrosive. The story goes that local advisors urged Pope Clement VIII to ban coffee outright, and that the Pope, ever curious, asked to try a cup before making his decision. According to the legend, he found it so delicious that he declared it a shame to let Muslims have exclusive claim to such a drink, and joked that it should be baptized to make it a true Christian beverage. Whether every detail of this story is historically accurate remains debated among scholars, since the earliest written versions of it appeared decades after Clement's death. But whether it happened exactly this way or not, coffee did receive tacit approval in Catholic Europe around this period, and it never looked back. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. In 1683, the Ottoman Empire laid siege to the city of Vienna, surrounding it with an army estimated at well over 100,000 soldiers. For 2 months, the city starved behind its walls, waiting for relief that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. Then, in September of that year, a combined European army broke the siege and routed the Ottoman forces, who fled so quickly they left behind their entire camp, including, according to a popular and often repeated legend, hundreds of sacks of unfamiliar green beans. Viennese soldiers reportedly assumed the sacks were camel feed and nearly burned them. A local man, sometimes identified as Georg Franz Kolschitsky, a merchant who had lived among the Ottomans and recognized the beans for what they were, is said to have claimed the sacks as his reward for his role in the siege and used them to open one of Vienna's first coffee houses. Historians have poked substantial holes in the details of this particular legend over the years, and there is real evidence coffee had already reached parts of Central Europe before this. But the broader picture, an empire's failed siege accidentally seeding one of Europe's great coffee cultures, captures something true about how unpredictably this drink kept spreading. This decision, this accident, this leftover sack of beans seemed small at the time. It was not. By the mid-1600s, coffee houses had exploded across London, and they earned a nickname that tells you everything about what they had become: penny universities. For the price of a single penny, any man, regardless of class or profession, could sit for hours, drink coffee, and take part in conversations with merchants, scientists, poets, and politicians he would never otherwise have access to. This was not about seasoning a drink with sugar and cream. Coffee houses were becoming the actual infrastructure of the Enlightenment. Isaac Newton reportedly dissected a dolphin on a coffeehouse table. Members of what would become the Royal Society debated new scientific theories over cups of it. A group of merchants meeting regularly at a particular coffeehouse run by a man named Edward Lloyd began discussing shipping news and insurance deals, an informal gathering that would eventually grow into Lloyd's of London, one of the most powerful insurance markets on the planet, essentially the Bloomberg terminal of the 17th century, just with worse chairs and better gossip. Coffee was not a beverage anymore. It was becoming the operating system for early modern capitalism, science, and journalism, all running out of the same smoky room. If you are finding this interesting so far, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because we tell stories exactly like this every single week, tracing the hidden history behind the objects you touch without thinking about them. And you will not want to miss what is coming in this one, because the story of coffee is about to turn very dark, very fast. For nearly 200 years, the Arab world's export ban had held. Coffee could be brewed anywhere, but it could only be grown at scale in Yemen and parts of the Ottoman world. That monopoly finally broke, and it broke through smuggling. Around 1690, Dutch traders managed to obtain live coffee plants, reportedly through a combination of bribery and theft in the port of Mecca, and successfully cultivated them in greenhouses back in Amsterdam before transplanting seedlings to their colony on the island of Java in what is now Indonesia. This is the origin of the word Mocha Java, a term still stamped on coffee bags today. One word for the port where the smuggling happened, one word for the island where the monopoly finally died. The most famous chapter in this saga, though, belongs to a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu. In 1723, de Clieu obtained a coffee seedling, reportedly a gift or a theft from the royal greenhouse in Paris, depending on which version of the story you believe, and set out to carry it across the Atlantic to the French colony of Martinique. The voyage was brutal. Pirates attacked the ship. A violent storm nearly capsized it. Fresh water ran dangerously low, and according to legend, de Clieu shared his own ration drinking water with the plant to keep it alive, going thirsty himself so a coffee seedling would not die at sea. Whether every detail of that particular legend is precisely accurate is again genuinely debated by historians. But what is beyond dispute is the outcome. That single seedling, or a handful of seedlings depending on the source, is credited with becoming the genetic ancestor of an enormous share of the coffee trees eventually planted across the Caribbean and Latin America. One smuggled plant, an entire hemisphere of coffee production traced back to it. Money quite literally grew on trees, and Europe had just planted the seeds of its own colonial coffee empire. And that profit motive is where this story turns dark. Coffee cultivation is brutally labor-intensive. Cherries must be picked by hand at the right moment of ripeness, then pulped, fermented, washed, dried, and sorted, all before roasting even begins. European colonial powers did not solve this labor problem through wages. They solved it through slavery. Nowhere is this darker chapter more visible than on the island then called Saint-Domingue, the French colony that would later become Haiti. By the late 1700s, Saint-Domingue had become the single largest coffee producer on Earth, supplying roughly half of the world's coffee at its peak, alongside enormous quantities of sugar. And it produced that coffee using an enslaved workforce numbering in the hundreds of thousands, forced to work under conditions so brutal that the average life expectancy of an enslaved person on a Caribbean plantation after arrival was often cited by historians at somewhere around 7 years. 7 years. Coffee did not simply benefit from slavery in the Caribbean. Coffee, alongside sugar, actively drove the demand for it. Plantation owners calculated in cold financial terms that it was often cheaper to work enslaved people to death and purchase replacements than to improve their conditions. This is not hyperbole. This is documented in the account books of the era, in the correspondence of colonial administrators, in the plantation manuals themselves. The wealth flowing back to France from Saint-Domingue's coffee and sugar exports was staggering, funding aristocratic fortunes, funding the glittering excess of pre-revolutionary Paris, built on a foundation of unimaginable human suffering an ocean away. In 1791, the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue rose up in what became the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in history to result in the founding of an independent nation. The coffee industry that had enriched France for generations was shattered almost overnight. Plantations burned, production collapsing for decades afterward. The work itself, on both islands and mainland plantations alike, followed a brutal daily rhythm. Enslaved laborers rose before dawn and worked until well after dark during harvest season, picking cherries by hand under a punishing tropical sun, then hauling them to processing stations where the fruit was pulped, fermented in shallow tanks that reeked of sugar and rot, washed, and spread out on massive drying patios to bake under the same sun the workers had just spent all day standing beneath. Overseers, often paid a commission tied directly to output, had every financial incentive to push workers past the point of exhaustion. Punishments for slowing down, for illness, for simply failing to meet an arbitrary daily quota were routinely violent, and colonial legal codes of the era, including the infamous Code Noir that governed French colonies like Saint-Domingue, explicitly permitted forms of corporal punishment that would be described today, without exaggeration, as torture. This was not an unfortunate side effect of the coffee trade. This was the coffee trade, functioning exactly as its owners designed it to function. Brazil, meanwhile, was quietly building what would become the largest coffee economy the world has ever seen, and it built that economy the exact same way. Coffee arrived in Brazil in the early 1700s, and by the 1800s, Brazil had become the dominant force in global coffee production, a position it has never fully relinquished since. That expansion was fueled overwhelmingly by enslaved African labor, with estimates suggesting that Brazil imported more enslaved people over the course of its history than any other country in the Americas, a substantial share of them working at various points in coffee cultivation. Brazil did not formally abolish slavery until 1888, making it the very last country in the Western Hemisphere to do so, decades after most of Europe and the United States had already ended the practice. Here is the part that should make you angry. Coffee, the drink that fueled Enlightenment coffee houses, funded insurance empires, and sat at the center of civilized conversation across Europe, existed in that same era almost entirely because of forced, unpaid, brutal human labor on the other side of the ocean. The people drinking it in London and Paris rarely saw the plantations, they just saw the cup. This is where the story shifts, from empire and atrocity to invention and speed. Because coffee's next great transformation was not political, it was mechanical. Through most of coffee's history, it remained a slow, artisanal, deeply local product. Beans were roasted in small batches, often at home or by a neighborhood grocer, over an open flame or in a simple pan, and they went stale within days. There was no packaging science, no shelf stability, nothing resembling the coffee aisle you walk through today. That began to change in the 1800s as the broader machinery of the Industrial Revolution turned its attention to food processing itself. In 1864, two brothers, John and Charles Arbuckle, patented a method for coating roasted coffee beans in a thin glaze of egg and sugar, which helped seal in freshness and allowed roasted coffee to be packaged, shipped, and sold at a scale that had never before been possible. Arbuckle's Ariosa brand coffee became a fixture on American frontier wagon trains and cattle drives, so ubiquitous among cowboys in the American West that some accounts describe it functioning almost like currency in remote outposts, traded, bartered, and rationed alongside flour and salt. Here is the detail that makes this strange. A product once so precious that sultans executed people over it had within roughly 3 centuries become standard-issue rations for cattle drivers sleeping under the stars in Texas. This is where the story takes another turn nobody expected, because packaging turned out to matter almost as much as the beans themselves. Before the Arbuckle brothers' innovation, buying coffee meant buying green, unroasted beans from a general store, taking them home, and roasting them yourself in a skillet over a stove, a process that was time-consuming, inconsistent, and easy to ruin. Pre-roasted, pre-packaged coffee sounds unremarkable today. In the 1860s, it was closer to a small miracle, freeing an enormous amount of domestic labor, mostly performed by women, and standardizing a product that had previously varied wildly from household to household. Other companies raced to copy the model, and by the turn of the 20th century, brands like Chase and Sanborn and eventually Maxwell House, named, according to company lore, after a hotel in Nashville, Tennessee, where the coffee was reportedly served to guests, including President Theodore Roosevelt, had turned roasted, branded, packaged coffee into a genuine national industry in the United States. Then came instant coffee, and here the story gets genuinely surprising, because the breakthrough did not come from Europe's old coffeehouse capitals at all. In 1901, a Japanese-American chemist named Satoru Kato developed an early soluble coffee powder, and just a few years later, in 1906, an American-based inventor named George Constant Washington, working in Guatemala, developed his own commercially successful instant coffee process after noticing a powdery residue forming on the spout of his silver coffee carafe. He would go on to found the G. Washington Coffee Company, and by the time American soldiers shipped out for the First World War, instant coffee had become standard-issue military supply, valued for one reason above all others: it could be prepared instantly, in the field, with no equipment beyond hot water. War does not care about flavor nuance. War cares about speed, and instant coffee delivered exactly that. Decaffeinated coffee arrived around the same period, developed commercially by a German coffee merchant named Ludwig Roselius in the early 1900s, after a shipment of his coffee beans was accidentally soaked in seawater during a storm at sea, stripping much of the caffeine while, according to Roselius, preserving much of the flavor. Whether the accident happened in exactly the dramatic fashion later marketing suggested is once again difficult to verify with total certainty, but the resulting product, marketed under the brand name Sanka, became one of the first widely available decaffeinated coffees in the world. By the middle of the 20th century, coffee had become fully industrialized, fully global, and fully embedded in the rhythm of the modern workday. Companies like Maxwell House and Folgers built massive advertising campaigns explicitly tying coffee to productivity, to the American workplace, to the idea of the coffee break as an earned, almost patriotic ritual. And that association was not an accident either. During both world wars, coffee was treated by multiple governments as a strategic material, essential to military and civilian morale alike, rationed, stockpiled, and in some cases smuggled across blockades, specifically because armies and factory workers alike depended on it to function through exhausting shifts. The drink that had once fueled Sufi monks through all-night prayer sessions was now fueling assembly line workers through double shifts. Same chemical, same core function, completely different world. Which brings us to today. And here is a number that tends to surprise people. Global coffee consumption now sits at somewhere around 2.5 billion cups consumed every single day, across virtually every country on Earth. Coffee is grown commercially in roughly 50 countries, almost all of them clustered in a narrow band around the equator, sometimes called the Bean Belt, running through Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. Brazil remains by a wide margin the largest producer on the planet, followed by Vietnam, a country that barely registered as a coffee producer before the 1980s, and now stands as the second largest source of coffee in the world, largely on the strength of Robusta beans grown at massive scale. The global coffee industry is frequently estimated to be worth well over $100 billion annually when you account for the full supply chain, from the farmer picking cherries by hand to the barista steaming milk in a shop in downtown Chicago. Coffee is often described in casual conversation as the second most traded commodity on Earth after oil, a claim that has been repeated so often it has become something close to folklore. Rigorous trade data does not fully support that specific ranking, but even without the exaggeration, coffee remains one of the most valuable agricultural commodities traded across international markets, supporting an estimated 125 million people worldwide through its cultivation, processing, and sale. The most recent chapter in coffee's long story is often called the specialty coffee movement, sometimes referred to by industry writers as the third wave, following the first wave of mass-market instant and canned coffee, and a second wave defined largely by one company, Starbucks, founded in Seattle in 1971 as a single small store selling roasted beans and equipment rather than brewed drinks. Under the leadership of Howard Schultz, who joined the company in the early 1980s after being inspired by the espresso bars he encountered on a trip to Milan, Starbucks pivoted towards selling coffee as an experience rather than a commodity, essentially applying the fast food playbook to a 5,000-year-old plant, and in doing so, built a company that now operates tens of thousands of locations across dozens of countries. The third wave that followed reacted directly against that model, emphasizing single farm origins, detailed roast profiles, and prices that can run into double digits for a single cup, treating coffee less like fuel and more the way a sommelier treats wine. It is, in a strange way, the coffee house of Ottoman Constantinople and the coffee house of modern Seattle, serving remarkably similar social functions 5 centuries apart. A place to sit, to think, to talk, and to be seen doing it. But coffee is far more than just a morning beverage, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. The active compound behind almost everything coffee does to your body, caffeine, is quietly embedded in products you would never think to associate with a coffee farm. It is in headache medication, where it helps other painkillers absorb faster into the bloodstream. It is in soft drinks that have nothing to do with coffee flavor at all. It is used in some agricultural pesticides, since caffeine is mildly toxic to many insects, a natural defense mechanism the coffee plant evolved millions of years before any human ever roasted a bean. Caffeine is, by a wide margin, the most widely consumed psychoactive substance on the entire planet, legal in nearly every country on Earth, consumed daily by a majority of adults worldwide, and almost nobody thinks of it that way. You would never describe your morning coffee as taking a drug. But pharmacologically, that is precisely what is happening, and it happens roughly 2.5 billion times a day worldwide without a second thought. And there is one more curveball worth mentioning. Researchers and coffee companies alike have spent decades trying to develop caffeine-free coffee plants through natural breeding rather than chemical decaffeination. And separately, some scientists have explored lab-grown coffee, cultivated from plant cells rather than farms, as a potential hedge against a genuinely alarming modern threat: climate change. Rising temperatures and shifting rainfall patterns across the traditional bean belt have already reduced the amount of land suitable for growing high-quality Arabica coffee, and some studies project that a substantial share of current coffee-growing regions could become unsuitable for cultivation within the coming decades. The plant that survived Ottoman bans, papal suspicion, colonial slavery, and 2 world wars may ultimately face its most serious threat, not from a government or a rival empire, but from the climate itself. So let us take the whole journey, start to finish. It was there in the highlands of Ethiopia, chewed by warriors who had no word for caffeine, but understood exactly what it did for them. It was there in the monasteries of Yemen, keeping monks awake through nights of prayer. It was there in the coffee houses of the Ottoman Empire, feared by sultans as a breeding ground for rebellion. It was there in the drawing rooms of Enlightenment Europe, fueling scientific societies and insurance markets, and the earliest stirrings of modern capitalism. It was there on the plantations of Saint-Domingue in Brazil, extracted through slave labor on a scale that funded empires and destroyed millions of lives in the process. It was there in the saddlebags of cattle drivers crossing the American frontier, and in the ration kits of soldiers crossing the trenches of 2 world wars. And it is there right now, almost certainly, within arm's reach of wherever you are sitting, in a mug, a paper cup, or a can. costing you the rough equivalent of pocket change for something people once tried to legislate, threaten, and burn out of existence. Not bad for a bitter jungleberry that a governor in Mecca once tried to have executed alongside the people who drank it. Coffee is never just coffee. It never was. If any part of this history surprised you, let me know in the comments. I genuinely want to hear which chapter caught you off guard. And if you enjoyed this one, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because we have a lot more stories like this coming. And I will see you in the next one.